All right, so Theranos, right? Silicon Valley, huge success, all over the news, and then boom, gone. Like $1 billion just poof. Makes you wonder, how did so many smart people, I mean, seriously smart people, get pulled into this?
It's really incredible the scale of this whole thing, this big, huge promise, like they were going to revolutionize healthcare. And they did it with such, I don't know, such confidence that they kind of sidestepped all the usual checks and balances. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like it makes you think about like how much power belief has, right? The
Yeah.
power of a good story, especially in the business world.
Yeah, totally. So today we're doing a deep dive on Theranos. We've got all these reports and articles, tons of stuff, and they all basically tell the story of this company that was built on, well, a revolutionary idea that kind of didn't actually work.
Yeah.
So what we want to do today, our mission, is to figure out, like, how did this happen? What were the, like, warning signs, the red flags that people had seen? And then how did the truth finally come out? But the most important thing, I think, is, like, what can investors, maybe even you listening right now, learn from this? We don't want to get too bogged down in the technical stuff, keep it interesting.
I think looking at the big picture, this is it's a really strong reminder that even when you're dealing with cutting-edge stuff, innovative companies, you can't forget about critical thinking. You have to do your homework. Everyone loves a good disruption story, but you have to look beyond the hype. Theranos, it's like a case study in what happens when you lose that balance.
Couldn't agree more. So let's rewind back to the beginning. Elizabeth Holmes, 19 years old, drops out of Stanford right back in 2003. And she was driven by this fear of needles, which is, well, kind of ironic, right? Because that fear is what led her to want to change blood testing completely. It's like poetic, but in a kind of messed up way.
What's really interesting about her origin story is how well it was put together right from the start. I mean, young, determined woman taking on a problem everyone hates, needles, and she's got this bold tech solution. I mean, it's the classic Silicon Valley story.
Yeah.
But, looking back, you have to wonder, maybe this fear of hers, maybe it made her oversimplify things like blood diagnostics. It's complex stuff.
For sure. So her big idea was this little machine. They call it the Edison. It was supposed to run hundreds of medical tests, all kinds of tests, from just a couple of drops of blood. Just a little finger prick,
Yeah.
None of those huge needles and vials of blood. I mean, it sounded like sci-fi coming to life.
And the potential benefits, right?
Yeah.
Huge, right? Faster results, maybe cheaper too, and definitely way more comfortable for patients. Imagine making blood tests that easy, maybe even something you can do at home. Super appealing idea. And that promise, democratizing healthcare through technology, that's powerful stuff. But let's be real, getting hundreds of tests from one drop of blood, that goes against a lot of what we know about how blood tests work. You usually need more blood, and each test needs specific stuff. Reagents. So Theranos' claims, they were, ambitious, to put it mildly.
It's easy to see why people got excited. And Holmes, she had this charisma, she was super focused, and she brought in some really impressive people, advisors, early investors. So by 2010, just 7 years after starting, Theranos hit that billion-dollar valuation.
Unicorn
status, right? And that kind of fast success that gets everyone's attention.
It really shows you how powerful a vision can be, especially when you have a leader who can sell it. Holmes, she cultivated this image, the black turtleneck, always talking about her mission. She was like a Steve Jobs, but for biotech. That image, it became a big part of the Theranos mystique.
And then, talk about powerful people, the board of directors she put together. Wow. Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, George Shultz, another former Secretary of State, and then General James Mattis. I mean, come on, that's a serious lineup. Gave Theranos so much credibility. And these weren't like random people, this was the big leagues, which looking back is kind of crazy. Shows you how convincing Holmes was.
Absolutely. Having those big names on the board, it reassured investors and the public. Made it seem like, everything must be legit, right?
Yeah.
But when you look close, you realize there wasn't anyone on that board who was like a real expert in blood testing. It's a key detail, Makes you wonder who was there to actually challenge the science.
Fast forward to 2014, and Holmes is on every magazine cover. Youngest self-made female billionaire, right? Her part of Theranos was worth, on paper, $4.5 billion. It's the classic American dream story, The young innovator who's changing the world and getting rich doing it.
By this point, the story is set in stone, right?
Yeah.
Brilliant young founder, revolutionary technology, all these powerful people backing her. It was a picture of unstoppable success. And it makes sense, right? Not many people would think to question this meteoric rise. The hype train had left the station.
Totally. I mean, it was the perfect Silicon Valley fairy tale, right? Well, let's talk about the actual promise behind all this hype, the Edison machine. Hundreds of tests, just a tiny prick of blood. It still sounds crazy when you say it out loud, you know?
The promise, it was, well, revolutionary for sure. Imagine being able to detect diseases early, or having personalized health care, and just the ease of it all. They were addressing a real need, and it seemed like a really elegant solution. Of course, investors were going crazy for it. I mean, the market potential was enormous.
And the investors, they were like totally captivated. Think about it. The market for something like that, it's huge. And then you add the humanitarian aspect, making healthcare more accessible. I mean, it felt like there was no limit.
And then you have Holmes herself, the way she pitched it, her whole persona, it just amplified the hype. She talked about like proactive healthcare, giving people the tools to manage their own health. And she did these demos, very controlled, but they were enough to convince people. I mean, she was a really good performer.
She was even called like the next Steve Jobs of biotech. People were comparing them to Apple, saying they were going to revolutionize an industry. That kind of comparison is really powerful for investors. Everyone wants to get in early on the next big thing.
Totally. That comparison, it's like it taps into past successes, right? Creates this sense of inevitability. People start imagining Apple's success, but in healthcare, even if the realities are completely different.
And look at who invested. Rupert Murdoch, Larry Ellison, the Walton family, Betsy DeVos. I mean, these are big, serious players, and they all bought into it. That kind of validation, it means a lot to other investors.
For sure. These aren't like casual investors, right? These are people with tons of resources, their own advisors. Their investment was a huge vote of confidence. But, as we know now, even the smartest people can miss things, important details.
And it wasn't just individuals. You had big companies getting involved too. Walgreens, they were going to put Theranos wellness centers in their stores. Safeway, they invested $350 million to build clinics. That's not small change. It made it seem like the technology was ready for like the mainstream.
Those partnerships were huge, for sure. They weren't just about money. They were about access,
Yeah.
access to customers, to infrastructure. It made this vision of Theranos everywhere seem real. But the thing is, those partnerships, they were based on promises, not on actual proof.
So by 2014, Theranos is worth what? $10 billion. They'd raised almost $700 million in funding. It looked like they were on top of the world, unstoppable.
It's like the potential was so huge, and they had all these big names behind them. It created this like shield of optimism. It was hard to see any problems, any cracks in the facade. And that fear of missing out, that's a powerful thing, even for investors. They can end up ignoring warning signs.
Which brings us to, well, the red flags. Because when you look back, there were definitely signs that something wasn't right, Beneath all that glitz and glamour, things weren't so perfect.
Absolutely. And one of the biggest red flags, right off the bat, was the secrecy. I mean, they were obsessed with secrecy. They never published any of their research in peer-reviewed journals.
Right.
That's like Science 101,
Right.
You put your work out there, other scientists check it, that's how you build trust. Theranos didn't do any of that. In science, peer review is like a safety check, right? You put your ideas out there, let other experts poke holes in them. That's how you make sure things are solid. Theranos skipped that whole process. It was a big departure from how things are usually done.
Exactly. And if anyone tried to ask, like, how does the technology actually work, Holmes would just, I don't know, she'd dodge the question. I read this article in The New Yorker. They called her technical explanations comically vague. Like she was saying a lot of words, but none of them actually meant anything.
That lack of transparency, that should have been a huge warning sign. In science, especially in medicine, you need scrutiny.
Yeah.
You need people checking your work to make sure it's accurate. Theranos, they avoided all of that. And that meant that the problems, the flaws, they could just like fester.
And it wasn't just like outside scrutiny they were avoiding. Think about the company leadership, the board of directors, all those big names, right? But how many of them actually knew anything about blood testing? They had tons of political power, business experience, but not much science in the mix.
That's a really important point. Sure, having powerful people on your board can open doors, but if they don't understand the science, they can't really oversee the technology, right? You need someone who can ask the hard questions, the technical questions. Theranos, they were more about connections than about like actual expertise.
And inside the company, it sounds like it wasn't a great place to work. People have said it was a culture of fear. Nobody shared information. Everyone had to sign these crazy NDAs.
Yeah.
It was like a pressure cooker environment.
When you have that kind of like compartmentalization where people can't talk to each other, can't raise concerns, that's usually a sign of trouble. If employees can't compare notes, if they're afraid to speak up, then problems can just get swept under the rug. And the fact that so many scientists quit, that should have been a red flag too. It meant that the people who actually understood the tech, they were seeing something they didn't like.
But the biggest issue, the lie at the heart of everything, was that the technology just didn't work. The Edison machines, they were unreliable. They only gave accurate results sometimes, not even most of the time. It was all smoke and mirrors.
It's crazy, right? The image they were projecting to the world and what was actually happening inside the company. Two completely different things. They were telling everyone about this revolutionary device, but internally, it was a mess. And they were desperate to keep that secret hidden.
So what did they do? They started committing fraud. They would take those tiny blood samples, sometimes even water them down, and then secretly run the tests on normal lab machines, you know, the kind you see in a hospital. Machines made by Siemens and others. It was a total bait and switch.
So basically, they were using the same technology they were claiming to replace, right? And
Yeah.
patients, investors, they had no clue. They all thought the results were coming from this amazing Theranos device. It's like a violation of trust, you know, in healthcare, in business. It's not right.
And Holmes and Sunny Balwani, he was the president and COO, they were the ones controlling everything. They even had separate teams, one working on the failing Theranos tech, and the other team, they were secretly using the real lab machines. I mean, it was a planned deception.
Yeah, this wasn't just like an accident, you know, this was deliberate. They set up these separate groups, these silos, so that nobody would know what was really going on.
Yeah.
It took a lot of work to keep that lie going.
And the lies, they went beyond the testing itself. They were creating fake evidence. Like, they made this document, it looked like an endorsement from Pfizer, the big drug company, you know. They used it to try and convince Walgreens and investors that Pfizer was on board, which was completely false.
It's a pretty bold rag.
That's insane, to just, like, create a document, make it look like it's from a reputable company. That shows you how desperate they were to keep up the facade. They were willing to cross any line.
And then there was this whole thing about the U.S. military, right? They were saying the military was using their devices on the battlefield in medevac helicopters, which if it were true, that would be a huge validation of the technology. But it was all a lie, made up to impress people.
To claim that the military was using your tech in life or death situations, I mean, that's incredibly powerful imagery, right? It makes investors feel good.
Right.
But it was all made up. It shows you how far they were willing to go. And their financial projections, they were like from another planet. They told investors they were going to make over $100 million in revenue in 2014. But in reality, they barely made anything, like a few $100,000.
Those inflated numbers, they were crucial, you know, to keep the story going, to keep investors pouring money in. It's a classic move in these kinds of schemes. Make it look like you're wildly successful and the money keeps flowing. But their actual performance, it was so far off from their projections. That should have been a major red flag.
So looking back, it's clear, right? There were all these red flags. No transparency, crazy claims that sounded too good to be true, a board of directors with no real expertise, a culture of fear and secrecy, ignoring the FDA. It's like a textbook example of what to watch out for. And to make things worse, a lot of their tests were what they call lab-developed tests. Basically, that means they didn't have to go through the same strict approval process with the FDA as other tests, which, okay, not a problem on its own, but it means the company has to do its own validation, be really transparent about their tech, which Theranos, well, they weren't.
You're right. Each one of those red flags, on its own, should have made people stop and think. But together, they painted a pretty clear picture that something was wrong. The lack of peer review, the questionable science, the board, the culture, it all pointed to a company that cared more about appearances than about substance. It was a whole chorus of warning signs, and most people just chose not to listen.
Theranos was like a house of cards, built on lies to investors, to partners, and, well, most importantly, to patients. It was just waiting to collapse.
And it took some brave people and some really good journalism to finally expose the truth. It just goes to show you the truth always comes out eventually.
You got that right. For years, Holmes managed to keep everything about Theranos secret. But the truth came out thanks to whistleblowers and some really dedicated reporters. It's a win for investigative journalism, for sure.
Those whistleblowers, Erica Chung and Tyler Schultz, they were incredibly brave. They were young, they believed in the company, but then they saw what was happening in the lab. The Edison machines weren't working. The company was using normal machines in secret. And they spoke up. They had so much integrity.
And Tyler Schultz, his grandfather, was George Schultz, one of the big names on the board of directors. Imagine that, seeing something seriously wrong in your own grandfather's company. It's got to be a tough situation.
That just shows you how strong their principles were. They were willing to risk their jobs, even face legal action, just to tell the truth. What they saw about the Edison machines, about the secret testing, it was crucial. They were the heroes of this story.
And inside Theranos, they weren't exactly welcomed with open arms. Their concerns were brushed aside. They were threatened. Tyler Schultz, he even tried to talk to his grandfather about it, but it didn't go anywhere. It shows you how closed off and defensive the company was.
That's another classic red flag.
Yeah.
A company that doesn't listen to its own employees, that tries to silence concerns. It means they're hiding something.
So, Chung and Schultz, they decided to go outside the company. They contacted John Kerry Rue, a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. And in October 2015, bam, he publishes this massive expose. It was like a bomb going off, completely blew up the Theranos story. He revealed that they weren't using their own technology, that they were relying on regular lab machines because the Edison was a failure. And he raised serious questions about the accuracy of their tests. That article changed everything.
That Wall Street Journal article, it was the turning point that brought all the problems, all the potential dangers out into the open. And because it was the Wall Street Journal, a respected publication, people paid attention. It forced everyone to take a closer look at Theranos.
And Holmes, her reaction, denial. Complete denial. She went on TV, said the article was false, claimed they had tons of evidence proving their technology worked. It was the classic PR playbook, but it didn't work.
It was what people do when they're caught lying, right?
Yeah.
They double down. But with Theranos, the evidence was piling up. It was only a matter of time.
But that first article, it was like opening a dam. More whistleblowers came forward, and the Wall Street Journal, they kept digging. They published more articles. They stood by their reporting. It shows you the power of good journalism.
Every new account, every new whistleblower, it just chipped away at Theranos' credibility. It became harder and harder for Holmes to maintain the lie. The evidence was overwhelming.
And Theranos, they didn't take it lying down. They hired lawyers, sent out threatening letters. Tyler Schultz, his relationship with his grandfather, it was really strained because of all this. They went on the attack.
That's what happens when companies try to silence the truth,
Sure.
They use intimidation. It shows you that they care more about control than about, doing the right thing. It's a sign of desperation.
But it didn't work. The truth was out, and the government got involved. The CMS, they found that the Theranos lab was seriously deficient, dangerous even. The FDA, state health authorities, they all started investigating. Things were getting serious.
And those government findings, they were really bad news for Theranos. When a lab gets cited for immediate jeopardy to patients, it's a big deal. It means they messed up badly, that patients could have been harmed. It was the beginning of the end.
And the media, they flipped the script. All those positive articles, gone. Now it was all investigations, skepticism. And then you had John Kerry Rue's book, Bad Blood, and the Dropout documentary and podcast. It became this cautionary tale for the whole tech industry.
Those books and documentaries, they gave people a deeper understanding of what happened at Theranos. They showed the extent of the deception, and they also highlighted the human side of it. The employees, the patients. It wasn't just a financial scandal. It was about real people.
It really comes down to the courage of people like Erica Chung and Tyler Schultz. Tyler, he said something that really stuck with me. He said, "It was clear that there was an open secret within Theranos, that this technology simply didn't exist." That pretty much sums it up, right?
That's the heart of it, right? The people who knew the most about the technology, they knew it was fake. And they were brave enough to speak up, even though it was risky. They did the right thing.
And once that secret was out, it all fell apart fast. By 2016, they were voiding test results. Holmes wasn't allowed to run a lab anymore. Walgreens and Safeway, they pulled out. And the company's value, it just crashed. It was a rapid downfall.
It shows you how fragile it all was. It was built on hype, on promises, but there was nothing real underneath. And once people saw that, the whole thing just crumbled.
And the aftermath was pretty intense, too. The lab shut down in 2016. The company was basically worthless. They tried to restructure, but it didn't work. By 2018, Theranos was officially dead.
The end of Theranos, it was the end of a crazy chapter, right? But the story didn't end there. There were legal consequences, serious ones.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In 2018, the SEC, they charged Theranos, Holmes, and Balwani with massive fraud. They said they lied to investors about the technology, about their finances. It was a big deal, holding them accountable.
And Holmes, she settled with the SEC. She had to give up control of the company, pay a fine, and she couldn't be in charge of a public company for 10 years. It was a civil penalty, but the criminal charges, those were still coming.
And those criminal charges, they hit in June 2018. Wire fraud, conspiracy. They basically said that they hadn't just misled investors, they defrauded doctors and patients too with those inaccurate blood tests. That's not something you see every day, startup execs facing criminal charges. It meant that what they did was really serious.
The criminal charges, they showed that this wasn't just about money, it was about potential harm to people. And you don't see that very often in Silicon Valley.
And then came the trials. Holmes, her trial was in 2021 and 2022. The jury found her guilty on 4 counts of investor fraud, but not guilty on others. And on some of the patient fraud charges, the jury couldn't agree. It's hard to prove intent, what someone was really thinking.
The verdicts in Holmes's case, they were interesting, right? It was all about proving that she intentionally deceived investors. But with the patient fraud, it was more complicated. The jury couldn't decide if she meant to harm patients, even though there was a risk of harm.
And then Balwani's trial. That was in 2022. He was found guilty on all 12 counts, all of them. Defrauding investors, defrauding patients. It showed that he was really involved in the day-to-day operations, that he was responsible for what happened in the lab.
Balwani's conviction, it showed that he was directly involved in the deception. The jury believed that he was responsible for the harm that was caused. It was a different outcome than Holmes's trial, and it showed that he was more culpable.
And the sentences were pretty harsh. Holmes got over 11 years in prison, Balwani almost 13. That sends a message, doesn't it? Especially in the world of white-collar crime, tech crime. It means that you can't get away with this kind of fraud.
Those sentences, they were significant, for sure. They showed that the courts were taking this seriously, that they recognized the damage that was done. And Holmes was ordered to pay over $452 million back to the investors she defrauded. That's a lot of money. And it shows the financial impact of what happened. Those are some of the longest sentences we've seen in Silicon Valley for fraud.
And the investors who lost money, some of them were huge names. Rupert Murdoch lost over $100 million. The Walton family lost $150 million. Betsy DeVos' family lost $100 million. It just goes on and on. It shows you, even if you're rich and powerful, you can still get tricked.
It's humbling, isn't it? Even the smartest, most experienced investors, they can fall for a good story. It's a reminder that we all need to be careful.
And it wasn't just the big investors, right? Walgreens, Safeway, they both lost a ton of money on their partnerships with Theranos. It was a costly lesson for them.
Yeah, it wasn't just about people losing money on their investments. Those companies, they put their reputations on the line and they paid the price. It shows that companies, big or small, they need to do their homework before they partner with anyone.
But the worst part of all this, the real tragedy, is the patients who got inaccurate test results. Some people were told they had serious diseases when they didn't. Others were told they were fine when they were actually sick. It could have been really dangerous.
Thankfully, as far as we know, nobody died because of the faulty tests. But there was a real risk of harm, and that's what Balwani was convicted of, patient fraud. Holmes, she was acquitted on those charges, but the whole scandal, it made people distrust lab tests. That's a hard thing to rebuild, trust.
You're right. So Theranos, it's become this cautionary tale, a symbol of how not to run a startup. It's made people question that whole fake it till you make it mentality in Silicon Valley. And it's made investors think twice about how much due diligence they're doing. It's a story that's still relevant today.
Absolutely. And it's a great example for investors, a reminder that just because something sounds amazing doesn't mean it's true. There's a lesson here about being skeptical, about not getting caught up in the hype.
So if you're thinking about investing in a company, especially one that claims to be revolutionary, what's the first thing you should do? What should you ask for?
The most important thing is to do your research. Don't just take their word for it. Ask for proof. Especially with healthcare and tech, it's easy to make big promises. Demand data, independent verification, and be wary of companies that are secretive or just give you marketing fluff. Ask yourself, where's the data, and has anyone else checked this out? If a company avoids those questions, it's a bad sign. Investors, they should have demanded more from Theranos. They should have asked for peer-reviewed research or for an independent lab to verify the technology. Don't get fooled by fancy brochures and empty promises.
So ask the hard questions, right? Don't just get swept up in the excitement. Look for concrete evidence.
Exactly. And another thing, if you're investing in something you don't understand, like biotech or AI, find an expert who does.
Yeah.
Holmes was able to fool a lot of people because they didn't know much about blood testing. Get an independent expert. someone who can evaluate the technology, the science behind it. If a company doesn't want that, it's a red flag. They're probably hiding something.
So get a second opinion, right, from someone who knows what they're talking about.
And be skeptical of anything that sounds too good to be true. Like Theranos claiming they could run hundreds of tests from a single drop of blood. That should have made people pause, right? Balance your excitement with some common sense. If something seems impossible, it probably is. Experts back in 2015, they were already questioning Theranos' claims. It just didn't make sense scientifically. But people ignored them. Don't let excitement cloud your judgment. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Scammers, they prey on that kind of naive optimism.
So if something feels off, trust your gut. Don't ignore those warning signs.
Another thing to watch out for is transparency. If a company is really secretive about their technology, if they won't explain how it works, that's a problem. Real innovators, they're usually happy to show their work, even if it's under a non-disclosure agreement. Theranos, they were all about mystique. And Holmes, she was really good at giving vague answers. That should have been a red flag. Theranos, they relied on their image, on Holmes's charisma, but there wasn't much substance behind it. Legitimate companies, they're willing to let you peek behind the curtain, even if you have to sign an NDA.
So if they're not willing to be open about their technology, that's a big warning sign.
And look at the team, the people running the company. Do they have experience in the field? Theranos' board, they were all big names, but none of them really knew about blood testing. A good company has leaders who understand the industry. And look at the company culture. Is it open and collaborative, or is it secretive and controlling? If there's a cult of personality around the CEO, that's a danger sign. Theranos' board, they were missing something crucial: expertise in medical diagnostics. A good company has leaders who know the science, who could verify the claims. And the culture at Theranos, it was all about secrecy, about not questioning the leadership. That's a recipe for disaster.
So look beyond the names and titles, right? See if they actually know what they're doing.
And finally, don't just trust endorsements and partnerships. Just because a big company or a famous person is involved doesn't mean it's a good investment. Theranos, they used misleading partnerships to build their credibility. Do your own research, call the companies, the people involved, and make sure it's real. Theranos, they even forged documents to make it look like they had partnerships. That's how far they were willing to go.
So don't be lazy. Do your homework. Check those endorsements, those partnerships. Make sure they're real.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, don't let your emotions take over. It's easy to get caught up in the hype, to feel like you're missing out. But investing, it's about facts, not feelings. Stick to the fundamentals, look at the technology, the business model, and don't be afraid to take a step back, even if everyone else is jumping in. Theranos, they were really good at creating hype, at making people feel like they had to invest. They played on people's fear of missing out. But smart investors, they focus on the facts. They look at the company, the technology, and they don't get swayed by emotions.
So be skeptical, but also do your research. Don't just trust what you hear. Even smart people can make mistakes, especially when there's a lot of money involved.
You got it. The Theranos story, it's a reminder for all of us. Even if you think you're a savvy investor, you can still be fooled. It's all about being careful, being critical.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Theranos. It's a crazy story, but there are definitely some valuable lessons to learn.
It is, for sure. It's a reminder that even in the world of innovation, there are people who will try to take advantage of you. Be smart, be skeptical, and do your research.
And if you like this deep dive, make sure to subscribe to the show. We've got more stories like this, more deep dives into the world of business and investing. And check out our website. We've got tons of articles and analysis to help you make smart decisions.
It's all about staying informed, about understanding how the world works. And that's what we're here to help you do.
So until next time, thanks for listening. And remember, when it comes to investing, keep your eyes open and your mind sharp. Stay safe out there.
And invest wisely.